recording is on.
So I'm talking with Jesse today, and we're going through and thinking about Plenti and its architecture and things with a critical eye, and thinking through maybe what are some potential challenges with the architecture, and trying to see around corners for long-term planning and how things are set up. So, Jesse, I don't want to speak for you, but you were just talking a second ago about the CMS being tightly coupled with the framework itself and why that can be challenging. And it seemed to me that you think there might be some challenges with adoption, but also just with like making the project useful and interesting. Do you mind kind of like articulating that? And we can.
Yeah, I think the CMS being tightly coupled like limits the uses of
Mm,
what can be done with it. But
yep.
in some cases, it's good for productizing the Plenti framework itself.
Yeah. Yeah. You definitely, I feel like, could have more developer users if you can use it for other
Yeah,
frameworks, right? Because then all of a sudden it can be used across many projects.
yeah,
And Plenti, you're limited to people who are in Plenti, and obviously the Plenti ecosystem is very small. So yeah, I totally get that. I think my thinking of where my head was at when trying to think through that was there are a couple of good, like pretty good Git-backed CMS solutions out there. Netlify CMS being one, and Tina CMS being another. And I know what we're doing is a little different, obviously, and especially being Svelte based, and those are both React based and everything. So I think there's definitely a market for generic CMS. I was hoping to get around some of the issues that they had with when you're implementing those CMSs. Like if you put like Netlify CMS with Hugo, it's really hard to get previews to work, things like that. And
yeah,
then also connecting the data source, there's a little more scaffolding right now. Obviously, right now with the discoverable CMS, there's like almost no scaffolding, right? Like it just kind of
yeah.
tries to figure it out, and which has its own problems. Don't get me wrong. But the idea was to try to make the thing work very easily out of the box in terms of getting those things set up that way.
Yeah. And the idea of like editing on page, like editing the content itself on page, is something that we didn't really go towards yet, at least.
Yeah, and that was actually surprising to me. My intention was fully to like be clicking on the rendered HTML to edit it, and then it became apparent that it would be easier to just get at the content source first. So I think I did that out of ease of development. But yeah, I'm not sure how I'm going to bake that in eventually, but that is something that I would like to eventually go around to. It's like, okay, like you're viewing the rendered page and like clicking on it to manipulate those components. That would be great.
Mm.
But right now we kind of have like the sidebar and then the content. So yeah,
Yeah,
those are great questions. And also like, how do we tie in? Like I want, only to display WYSIWYGs when we're rendering out HTML, right? So how do we tie into the template to manipulate the content? These are all things that I'm thinking about.
I'm having quite a bad connection currently, but
Oh no,
if
are
it's
you?
fine to you, it's good.
Okay, I can hear you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's, it has turned off the video to save bandwidth.
Oh no, for me, I'm gone.
Yeah,
Oh no.
yeah,
Okay. All right. Let's
it's
see.
okay. It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Um. So yeah. So are there other? Do you have other kind of like criticisms or kind of like concerns of the architecture or where the project's going?
Yeah. I don't know. It's like quite good otherwise. Like I don't know what else to criticize about. It's good to have like yeah.
I sometimes worry that we're almost barking up the wrong tree in a certain way, right? So like we're in this very specific JavaScript ecosystem, and Plenty is like this hybrid thing there. It's kind of like a JavaScript app, but we're doing things our own way in a way that would be annoying to JavaScript developers. And I wonder if I'm like targeting the wrong thing, because I think we're ultimately going to more similar like a Hugo or a Jekyll like static site generator, right? With like superpowers. But we're playing in this league where everyone's like, huh, why is NPM a little weird in this project? Or like, why can't I, where's my Webpack? And like I think I'm trying to figure out why, certain areas we haven't gotten the traction that we want, right? Like I feel like in that space, it's just not, there's other frameworks that come on the scene that get a lot more traction. Of course, there's a lot of things to say about maturity and you know, the number of developers working on it and everything like that. But I wonder if we're kind of in the wrong space in that way too. So that's something that I've been thinking about myself.
Including like modules and libraries is quite hard currently with Plenti, and
Yep.
that's qu- like that's quite hard to like use the community made stuff in the
Yeah.
sites.
Yep. It definitely. And I'm coming across it now. I have some projects where I'm pulling in some other stuff, and it is kind of, it can be a pain in certain ways. So I think my initial thought was trying to simplify that tool chain, because I think,
Yeah.
you know, JavaScript developers have no problem with it, but there's a lot of new folks who like don't come from the JavaScript world and starting to pull in like Webpack, Babel, npm. It is confusing for folks. So like the whole idea was to simplify that, but that only works for the most simple apps, which I guess Plenti is kind of targeting anyways. Like we're trying to target very, very simple apps for the most part. But it makes it challenging when you want to add complexity and pull in other libraries. So yeah, that's something I'm going to have to think through at some point. Another thing that is slowly getting better over time, but is started out horrible for me, is the error handling is really challenging, right? Because we're running the JavaScript in V8 and then we're pulling those errors out into Go and then we're displaying them. So like sometimes, even for someone like you or I, who's pretty familiar with Plenti at this point, if we were to debug a complicated app that has lots of breakages, it would be frustrating to locate. I'm trying to make those better as I go. Like as I find really vague errors, I'm trying to go through and like pull out a JavaScript stack trace or something and make it better. But that is definitely for me another blemish that's just like, okay, this is top of mind. Like this needs to get better to make it a functional thing.
Yeah. I'm not so really familiar with Go, so working with Go has been like quite hard. Although
Mhm.
I've managed, but it could have been easier.
Yeah.
And I don't know if like it has any benefit to work in Go.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, I could totally see that being a valid criticism, because first of all, we're cutting off the whole JavaScript ecosystem, which this is, you know, it's a
Yeah.
JavaScript framework, right? And that makes it hard. I'll say a couple of things. I'm very impressed that you dove into the code base and you know, like the whole thing with Go being compiled, like and having to just do it. That's like a barrier that a lot of people wouldn't get into. And you were compiling the framework, you were testing things. I thought that was really cool, and you're making like valid PRs that I didn't need to adjust. So that was awesome. Congrats to you. And my thinking behind Go was it is more challenging than I expected. Like the whole compiling felt because that needs JavaScript, right? But the whole thinking behind Go was, you know, first of all, it's performance to do some of the tasks like gathering content sources and doing things like that. Obviously, it hits the bottleneck at the compilation step. But I also wanted it to be simple deployment. So like simple binaries that can be used, and then like we can create containers for each binary and then make that an easy CI process. Because in the future, the ideal world for me is that Plenti, you know, flesh out the CMS, and then when you deploy it, it's just this a simple binary that lives in CI that you can write back to, and it just that whole process becomes really, really fast, much, much faster than it is now. So you get something that feels like real-time feedback when you're making edits. But yeah, I understand the criticism there. Like every other app in this space is JavaScript based, and I think that helps a lot with adoption and attracting developers to the project. So I totally get that as valid. Any other comments or thoughts?
It's pretty much it. That's I like thrown out any criticism really that I have had
Great.
during the development of the Plenti CMS, and yeah, I trained out
Okay.
about from the not the yeah from the not feedback but the criticism.
Great.
There's no anything more. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking about this. I think it's really helpful for a project to take an honest eye at this and look and like keep readjusting some of the assumptions that have been made and that we think are solid. Obviously, some of those things are going to be hard or impossible to move. Like it's probably going to be a Go-based project, right? But it's good to know, because I think there are things that I can do to mitigate some of this stuff, hopefully, and make things better for folks. And I think the more honest we can be with ourselves about how it's set up, the better. So thank you for doing that. I'll stop the recording for now.